Hi everyone. Welcome to podcast LiteSpeak, your go-to podcast for mastering English, one episode at a time. I'm Emily, your host, and I'm so excited to have you here today. If you're looking to improve your English vocabulary, you've come to the right place. In today's episode, we'll be diving into some practical tips and tricks to help you expand your vocabulary, because let's be honest, sometimes it feels like there are just so many words to learn right, but don't worry, I've got your back. We're going to break it down into simple, actionable steps that you can start using today. And I'm not alone in this. I've brought along James, a fellow language enthusiast and someone who's been on his own journey of expanding his vocabulary. Hi James. How are you?
Hi Emily. I'm doing great, thanks. And I'm really excited to talk about this. Expanding vocabulary is something every language learner faces, but with the right approach, it can be a fun challenge rather than a daunting task.
Exactly. It's all about finding the right strategies. So, James, let's kick things off with the basics. What would you say is the first and most important step for someone trying to grow their English vocabulary?
I think the first tip is something we've probably all heard before, but it's worth repeating: read, and read some more. When you read, you expose yourself to a lot of new words naturally, and you see how they're used in context. It doesn't have to be textbooks either, pick something you enjoy. It could be novels, online articles, blogs, or even magazines.
Yes. That's so true. I remember when I first started really pushing myself to read in English, I started with topics that I loved. For example, I'm into travel, so I would read travel blogs and magazines. It made the whole process so much more enjoyable because I was genuinely interested in the content. What about you, James? What kind of reading material worked for you?
For me, it was fiction. I love reading novels, especially mysteries. And one thing I noticed is that when you read, you're not just memorizing words, you're learning how they fit into sentences and how native speakers actually use them.
That's a great point. Words in isolation don't always stick, but when you see them in action, they become easier to understand and remember. Speaking of remembering new words, what do you do when you come across words you don't know while reading?
Good question. I've made it a habit to keep a vocabulary journal. Every time I see a new word, I write it down along with the sentence it was used in. Later, I look up the meaning, and sometimes I even add my own example sentence. This way, I'm not just passively reading but actively engaging with the new vocabulary.
I love that idea. It's such an effective way to build up your word bank. Do you think it's important to set a specific goal, like writing down a certain number of new words per day or week?
I think that can help some people, but it's important to stay flexible. You don't want to overwhelm yourself. For example, if I read a chapter and find 20 new words, I might only write down 5 to 10 that seem useful or interesting to me. The key is consistency, making it part of your routine.
Yes, it's all about balance. Another tool I know many people use is flashcards. Do you use those for reviewing your new words?
Oh, absolutely. Flashcards are a great way to drill vocabulary quickly. I personally use Anki, which is an app that lets you create digital flashcards. The cool thing about Anki is that it uses spaced repetition, so the app shows you the words you're struggling with more frequently. It's a great way to make sure those new words stick in your memory.
I love Anki too. Flashcards are so convenient, you can review them anywhere, even if you only have a few minutes. And the best part is, you can add images, audio, or example sentences to help reinforce the meaning. Now, let's move on to another method that's often overlooked: listening.
Yes. Listening is incredibly important, not just for pronunciation but also for expanding vocabulary. When you listen to podcasts, audiobooks, or even watch TV shows and movies, you're exposed to conversational language, which is often more dynamic than what you'll find in textbooks.
Exactly. Plus, listening helps you understand how native speakers use idioms, phrasal verbs, and other tricky expressions. And don't you feel like sometimes, when you hear a word in a podcast or a movie, it suddenly makes more sense than when you just read it?
Definitely. Hearing words in context makes a huge difference. And for anyone who's just starting out, I'd recommend using subtitles at first or listening to podcasts with transcripts. That way, you can read along and connect what you hear with the written words. Then, as you get more confident, you can challenge yourself by listening without subtitles.
That's such a good tip. I remember when I started listening to English media, subtitles were my best friend. But as I got better, I tried to push myself by turning them off. And it really helped improve my listening skills. Another thing I want to touch on is how to make sure you're actually using the new words you learn. What do you think is the best way to incorporate new vocabulary into your daily life?
It's so important to actually use the words, otherwise you'll forget them. One method I recommend is to set a challenge for yourself. For example, try to use at least 2 to 3 new words in a conversation each day. If you don't have someone to talk to in English, you can write a short journal entry or even talk to yourself out loud using the new words. Another fun thing to do is teach the new words to a friend or family member. Explaining something to someone else really helps solidify it in your memory.
That's such a great idea. Teaching others is definitely one of the best ways to learn. And even if you don't have someone to practice with, you can always find online communities or language partners to chat with. There are so many platforms these days where you can meet fellow learners.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to make mistakes. The more you use the language, the more confident you'll become. Remember, the goal isn't perfection, it's progress.
Absolutely. So, to recap, read regularly, keep a vocabulary journal, use flashcards, listen to English media, and actively use new words in conversation. Do you have any final thoughts, James, before we wrap up?
Just one more thing, enjoy the process. Learning a language is a journey, and the more fun you have with it, the easier it will be to stay motivated. Find content that excites you, whether it's a book, a podcast, or even a YouTube channel, and keep challenging yourself little by little.
I love that. Make it fun, stay curious, and keep going. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, James. I'm sure our listeners have picked up some really useful tips.
Thanks for having me, Emily. It was a pleasure.
Alright, that's all for today's episode of Podcast LiteSpeak. If you found this episode helpful, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss any future tips on mastering English. And if you're watching on YouTube, go ahead and hit that like button and leave a comment telling us your favorite way to learn new words. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode. Keep practicing and keep growing your vocabulary, one word at a time.